Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. Namatu Acharya Sa. Okay, this next section is called Ubon. The history of Ubon began in 1778 with the conclusion of a bruising and bloodied migration. Some years previously, the noble Vientiane family of Chauprata and Chauprawa, together with its large retinue, had fled from the spite of the king of Vientiane, only to be attacked by his forces wherever they settled. Finally, in desperation, during a siege of their latest encampment, a small group of horsemen broke through the encircling forces late one night and rode west for assistance. The king of Siam was sympathetic towards them. His renascent state was rapidly recovering from the devastation of its capital Ayutthaya by the Burmese, and he was keen to extend its power. The Siamese expeditionary army routed the Vientiane forces with ease and went on to sack their city. Feeling secure at last, the migrants, survivors of a long flight and years of protracted strife, established a permanent settlement on the northern bank of the Moon River, some 80 kilometers west of its confluence with the Great Mekong. They called their new home Ubon, after the Upala lotus that rises unblemished from the mud. They pledged allegiance to the king of Siam, their savior and patron. But before all else, as migrating Thai peoples had done for hundreds of years, they built a monastery for the Buddhist monks that had accompanied them. By the early years of the 20th century, Ubon town had become the center of a province which included hundreds of villages and extended over thousands of square kilometers. During the preceding century, Siam had become surrounded by voracious colonial powers, Britain to the south and west, and France ominously to the east. The old Siamese system of government, whereby outlying vassal states enjoyed virtual autonomy, was now untenable. As a consequence, Ubon was integrated into the modern nation-state, being forged by King Chulalongkorn to meet the foreign threat, and came to be ruled from Bangkok. It is, however, unlikely that any more than a very few of the inhabitants of Ubon would have considered themselves part of anything as abstract as a nation. For most people, the village was their reality, and its independence and prosperity the source of their self-respect. These people's overriding concern was the daily struggle to feed their families, and their local monastery was the only institution they trusted. It was in Bangkok, one such small village, a few kilometers to the south of Ubon town, that Luang Por Chah was born. This next section is called Growing Up, and it's titled Cha, Chuang Chot. Chuang Chot is Ajahn Chah's surname. Luang Por Chah was born on the 7th waning day of the 7th moon of the year of the horse, 1918. He was the 5th of 11 children born to Ma and Pim Chuang Chot, who, like the vast majority of the generation, were subsistence rice farmers. The name Cha means clever, capable, resourceful. In accordance with custom, Luang Por's mother gave birth to him kneeling, her arms above her head, grasping a rope suspended from the rafters of the house. Afterwards, she endured 15 days of confinement, lying with her stomach as close as possible to a charcoal brazier to quote-unquote dry out her womb, an ancient custom that still survived in the countryside despite some 70 years previously King Mongkut railing against it as, quote, this senseless and monstrous crime of having women smoked and roasted, unquote. In his first months after weaning, Luang Por's mother would have fed him by chewing and masticating sticky rice in her own mouth and then gently spooning it into his. Luang Por was born into an affectionate and respected household, one of the wealthier families in a closely knit community. The Isan villages of those days, isolated by forests and vulnerable to the vagaries of the weather and the caprice of spirits, put great store on sharing, generosity, and harmony. The model was of extended families living together or in adjoining houses, and over generations, almost everybody in a village would be related at one remove or another with everybody else. Houses were made of wood, roofed with grass thatch and raised on stilts as protection from floods and wild animals. They were placed close together with no fixed boundaries between them. Life was conducted on a large open space upstairs, with rooms used only for sleeping. People not only heard their neighbors' family dramas, they could see them as well. There was no concept of privacy, much less a desire for it. The villagers subscribed to respect for monks, elders, and spirits. They valued consideration for the feelings of others and a healthy sense of shame. And there's a quote, or a footnote on that. In Thailand, the word shame means something slightly different from that generally understood in Western culture. And then he refers to a page later on hiri-otappa. And they relished laughter and conversation. Luang Por grew up with a strong sense of community and place, and the gift of the gab. The adjective that was often used to describe Luang Por in his later years, ebullient, is the one that comes most readily to mind when picturing him as a child. He had an outgoing, sunny, and occasionally exuberant disposition, but also possessed a keen, observant eye. He was nobody's fool. Luang Por bore the round face and flat, quote, lion's nose common to his race. More distinctively, his mouth was unusually wide and compelling. In contrast to the powerful symmetry of his face, his right ear was slightly larger than the left. He was acknowledged as the natural leader of his group of friends. Companions remembered him as the one whom everyone wanted to be close to, and without whom all games and adventures seemed dull. They recalled his even temper. They said he never enforced his dominance with bullying or coercion, and that no one could recall him in a fight. He was more likely to be a mediator in his companions' disputes, and from an early age, he was drawn by the yellow robe. In later years, he related childhood memories of dressing up as a monk. He said he would sit sternly on an old bamboo bed with his kama cloth. It's an all-purpose piece of cloth used by Thai males. It measures approximately 2 meters by 1 and is usually covered in a bright checkered pattern. It's used as a sarong, a bathing cloth, a towel, a shawl, a turban for carrying things, and even as a hammock. It's definitely an all-purpose cloth. So with his kama cloth draped over his left shoulder like a robe, while his friends played the parts of the laity. He remembered enacting the daily meal offering, presumably the only event in the monk's daily life that lent itself to drama. Luang Por would ring a bell and his friends would carry plates of fruit and cool water towards him. After bowing 3 times, they would offer it to him meekly. In return, he would give them the 5 precepts and a blessing. Isan culture lacks a hard and fast distinction between the ideas of work and play. The word ngan expresses this fluidity well, meaning both work and also festival, ceremony, or fair. Children brought up in the villages of Isan have always been taught to take on responsibilities from an early age, in the fields, in the house, and in raising younger siblings. For the most part, they seem to possess a natural talent for enjoying their duties. In Luang Por's day, children's main job would be taking the family's water buffaloes out to graze. They would also help in the search for extra food. Although mushroom gathering was a favorite occupation after rainfall, catching small creatures for the evening meal was the most common task. It may seem surprising that the devoutly Buddhist Isan villagers should be so ready to take life. The harshness of the environment undoubtedly played a part. Hunting was also a part of their culture that pre-existed their adoption of Buddhism by thousands of years, and which they never fully abandoned. Whatever the case, the Isan villagers ate living creatures without distinction. Insects, lizards, beetles, nothing was spared. After reading accounts of Isan village life in the early 20th century, it is easy to imagine the boy Cha in the hot season, riding a placid water buffalo out to pasture early in the morning, or in the stifling heat of midday, see him sitting in the shade of a mango tree, singing snatches of popular songs, munching lazily on a mango, or taking a nap. During a rainy season downpour, as a boisterous group of young kids chase after frogs and toads, he is surely the one in the lead, roaring at the top of his voice. In the cold season, he is on another hunting expedition, with friends watching from below. He climbs up a tree, grasping a long stick whose ends are smeared with viscous jackfruit sap, and touches the backs of the cicadas congregating on the cool wind-blown branches. As he puts his prizes in a lidded basket to take home for dinner, he puts 1 or 2 aside for blasting the eardrum of an unwary companion. Although these scenes have a definite charm to them, Luang Por believed that they bore an unseen shadow. In later years, he said that many of the illnesses that afflicted him throughout his life were the karmic consequences of casual cruelties he had inflicted on living creatures as a boy. Dekwat. By the 1920s, some 30 years after its inception, a state education system had still made few inroads into rural Isan. During Luang Por's childhood, 3 years of primary education were available, but they were not compulsory, and few parents saw their worth. Luang Por, by the age of 9, had completed a single year. Education of the young had traditionally been one of the major functions of the village monastery. Putting aside the glaring weakness that 50% of children, the girls, were excluded, the results were impressive. Foreign observers had often expressed surprise at the high standard of literacy among Thai men, and at the same time, interestingly enough, as praising what they saw as the superior shrewdness and industry of the women. The boys would help out with the monastery chores, and through daily personal contact with the monks and participating in the life of the Wat, and there's a footnote on that, the Thai word for a Buddhist temple or monastery. Throughout this book, this word will be used interchangeably with these 2 English terms. They received an education with a strong moral and spiritual foundation. It was a system that forged strong links between the monastery and the village, and it has been argued that the loss of this educational role to the state was a body blow to the rural Sangha's sense of purpose, from which it has never fully recovered. It was at the age of 9 that Luang Por asked permission from his parents to move out of the family home and into the local monastery. It was a common practice for parents to entrust a son to the monks, but rare for a boy to volunteer. Many years later, Luang Por spoke of his decision in the following way. Well, the causes and conditions were there. As a boy, I had a fear of committing evil actions. I was always a straightforward lad. I was honest, and I didn't tell lies. When there were things to be shared out, I was considerate. I would take less than my due. That basic nature just kept maturing until one day I said to myself, go to the monastery. I asked my friends if they had ever thought of doing the same thing, and none of them had. The idea just arose naturally. I'd say it was the fruit of past actions. As time went on, wholesome qualities steadily grew inside me until one day they led me to decide and do as I did. On another occasion, in a more humorous vein, Luang Por told some lay disciples that he had become a dekwat, a monastery child, because he was tired of watering the family tobacco fields. He said that the more he rebelled against his chores, the more his parents had given him, afraid that he would turn out badly. As one of Luang Por's sisters remembered it, a small accident brought things to a head. Him going to live in the monastery wasn't arranged by our parents. It was his own idea. One day he was helping his brothers and sisters pounding rice, but he wasn't putting much effort into it. Well, it so happened the pounder slipped out, and we had to drive in a wedge to keep it firm. He wouldn't help. But then, while the rest of us were doing it, he got hit by the wood we were using as a mallet. It must have hurt him because he got angry and shouted out, "That's it. I'm going to go and be a monk." Luang Por's parents took him to the local village monastery. Wat Ban Gaw was situated in a large sandy enclosure shaded by coconut palms, mango trees, and tamarinds, and consisted of a Dhamma hall, a monk's dormitory, and a water-ringed Uposatha hall. Poma and Ma Pim, and there's a footnote again, literally, Father Ma and Mother Pim. When Luang Por grew up, surnames had only very recently been adopted in Thailand. Generally, people would be referred to by their given name, prefaced by a familial honorific. They entrusted their son to the abbot with a predictable mixture of sadness and pride, and Luang Por was now a dekwat. But this was not the beginning of a long and painful separation from his parents. By no means had Luang Por withdrawn into a secluded and cloistered realm. The boundaries between the monastery and the surrounding world were marked not by imposing walls, but by a rather half-hearted bamboo fence. Indeed, the monastery was the central focus of the communal life of the village, rather than a refuge from it. In a sense, he had entered the world rather than left it. I'll leave it there.
Sadhu, 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 anumodami.
Luang Por, I have a question about, I think they address it a little bit later, but the Western monks get Pali names, and the Thai monks, I think, kept their original names, and I was wondering why that practice.
I just know that Ajahn Jayasaro kept his Never ever asked him. And certainly when I ordained, I sort of like, well, yeah, I feel this is something to aspire to live up to change from, so that I so just sort of the logic in it, and felt it was a good use of a convention.
So you went by Ajahn Pasanno even before you came to Wat Pah Pong?
Yeah, it just made more sense. And I mean, I'd already been that other person for a long time. It wasn't very satisfying.
What was that other person's name?
Read.
Reed.
Yeah.
Luang Por, do you remember the novice and seeing the way?
The novice in seeing.
The documentary when Luang Por Chah going to England.
Oh, the little novice.
Yeah. Is he still in?
No. He left, and he actually spent time over at Ajahn Chah as well. Yeah. Oh, he's a sharp kid. That was very common. I mean, those novices would come and spend, a year or 2 or 3, and then they would leave. But it's say like Ajahn Chah is one of the few who really ordained at a young age and then lived all the way through.
But Luang Por's name is Pasanno, right? Not Pasanno.
It's Pasanno.
Pasanno.
No, Pasanno.
Oh, Pasanno.
Pasanno. 1 S and 2 N's.
Luang Por, it sounds like that the villagers never really leave the village. It sounds like they live in there forever. Basically.
Well, yeah, no, it's true. There was, it was, village life, and it was communication, transportation were very limited, and there was a certain element of part of growing up in the old days for some people would be to leave the village for a while, looking for some kind of knowledge or experience they could bring back to their life. So that there was besides the element of, say a monastery or because that would oftentimes entail leaving the village when like taking ordination as a monk. But there was a certain value placed on that as well. Not everybody exercised it or took it, but that, because the village life was very prescribed. It's not that long ago in America is a bit different because it was always built on an ethos of expansion. But say places like England, even now, if you're in you're in something like you're at Amaravati, and you sort of think, well, I really want to go to Chithurst. So we'll have to wait until it's about an hour and a half drive. It's not that far, but it's the perception-wise, and then a southerner and a northerner. I mean, they're totally different worlds apart. And then also you're very much distinguished by not just regional but local dialects, English or accents and dialects, because that's people didn't move about that much. So I'd say. So I mean that's the whole. Probably a lot of the movement of modern culture is economic, with a sort of industrial revolution and a cash economies, whatnot. And that's only recently arrived in the northeast of Thailand. Like even when I first arrived, then there wasn't that much of a cash economy, and there wasn't that much of a. There certainly wasn't. Like now, people have. There's not more like just. It was very, very self-sufficient. The villages. But now there's a lot of trading and selling and taking things into market and whatnot. So it's and a lot more vegetables and fruit are grown and sold for cash crops and whatnot. Cash crops were only really introduced. That's why the forests of Thailand were devastated. And particularly these cash crops were beginning to be introduced in the 1950s. It's not that long ago.
Well, why was the Mon lineage of Theravada considered pure, and had it come from Sri Lanka recently as well?
It's because the king said it was.
He got her name like 20 times with them, right, in a row?
Yeah, it's an interesting obsession.
I seem to recall reading somewhere something like Luang Por Chah's generation was among the first who went to the schools where they learned Central Thai, and that kind of maybe before then they were still educated using the Isan dialect, and so Luang Por grew up in a sense bilingual. Do you know anything about that?
That I'm not sure. I would assume that would be the case, but say like even Luang Por getting 1 year of education or 3 years of primary school, up until fairly recently, then, but I would think certainly probably by the 50s, and schools were much more prevalent. And Ubon itself had a large teachers' college. So I had, but yeah, it is true. That's where they got introduced to Central Thai language.
How would you say that Thailand avoided getting colonized like the rest of the surrounding nations?
I mean, there's layers. There's many layers of that, but certainly the kings of Thailand at the time were and the ruling class were fairly savvy of how to also. It was a big trading center, and they also played the different colonial powers against each other. So there's a certain sort of duplicitousness that was needed. Say like when France sent gunboats up the Chao Phraya. They had taken over an area of Cambodia that was traditionally Thai, and they just grabbed it, and then King Chulalongkorn. It didn't have the standing army and the weaponry to deal with. And so one of the things that he did was then embarked on a foreign tour of England, Germany, Russia, not France, and then he didn't really have anything but it's just by cultivating the friendships and the contact, then France was willing to negotiate out of fear that they were cutting some sort of a deal with somebody other than them. So, so it was quite skillful and quite effective. They also put a large store in education and sending the young nobles mostly to the West to study and gaining increased knowledge and understanding of the West to be able to deal with the encroachment.
Luang Por was talking about how the village monastery is really the center of like a village, and we talked about like education being one thing that traditionally had done. But I was just wondering, like on a regular kind of basis, what sort of activities would be happening at the monastery? Like,
don't they eat every day?
Oh well, in addition to that, in addition to the meal.
No, it's sort of. It's part of the. So they would be there, and so that there's this both an informal contact, and then there's they'd probably join in pujas if they wanted to. There'd be certainly on the observance days, and then people would come and take precepts, join chanting, and chances are they wouldn't really listen to a Dhamma talk. Mostly, it'd be something that would be read to them. But it depends on the personality of the abbot. Oftentimes, the abbot would be like a mediator and sort of like a moral compass for the village. Also, basically, when a child is born and you bring the baby to have their haircut, their first haircutting is then blessings. Weddings, they don't oversee the weddings, but they would always come and offer their first meal, or then the monks would go to the house and do a blessing after the wedding. Deaths, cremations would take place. So sort of every level of or a new house is built, and you'd invite the monks to come and do a blessing for the house. So it's really interwoven with pretty much everything that goes on. And then you have ceremonies like the overtly religious ceremonies like Magha Puja and Visakha Puja, entering of the rains. But then you'd have somewhat religious, like the recitation of the life. In the northeast of Thailand, it's a huge festival, the recitation of the Vesantara Jataka. So that's usually like a whole day of recitations. And then your more kind of animistic ceremonies, like at the harvest time, it's almost like you're sort of trying say giving thanks to the gods that brought. I don't think they would say it like that, but that brought all the water and the rain the monsoon. So it's it's a very beautiful ceremony. You're floating like lotus flowers on the water, lit candles. They're very beautiful. The Thai New Year in April it'd always be at the monastery. I mean, even though it spreads out all over the place, but there'd be an element in the monastery. There'd be the beginning of the planting season. It's like a rocket festival. It's all in the northeast of Thailand. And all of those are, copious amounts of alcohol and music and So, but it'd all be a part of the monastery. The funerals, there'd be lots of gambling. Most festivals of any sort in Thailand, you'd have to have some sort of gambling. Changa?
In the old days, wasn't that much still Luang Por?
Really?
Yeah, when
Utai really bad.
Now, yes, but not when I was young. I don't think.
I think Utai is a really moral place. Where Jeep grew up.
Maybe more in Isan area. And then the children playground, that's where the children go play.
Yes, it's true. That's really
big thing.
the kid. Yeah, it really is like a public playground.
Mm-hmm. Just like a big open space there, or they?
Yeah. The monastery is really the center of the village.
Paul, there's the Ajahn Jayasaro mentioned a bit about hiri-otappa and shame that ties sort of. They have a different conception of that. I was wondering if you could elaborate what your experience of that is.
Well, I'll see what is written on hiri-otappa. This is a good and with when Ajahn Jayasaro in the sense of shame. So the lack of consensus among translators points to difficulty in finding words for these qualities, free of Judeo-Christian connotations, alien to their original meaning. Perhaps the distinguishing feature of these two terms is that, of hiri and otappa in terms of, is that they involve no idea of a shameful, quote-unquote shameful, or a quote-unquote bad self, only of shameful or bad actions. Hiri and otappa may be seen as, say, as emotions that arise naturally when unwise actions are seen in their true light. That's very different.
When you say that ties and in general, that it's like much more second nature to them, that kind of emotional response to bad actions, or
generally, yeah. Yeah, it doesn't have the same kind of tortured connotation that it has in for Westerners, or complicated. It's just not as complicated and messy and riven with self that is a characteristic of the kind of a Judeo-Christian kind of condition.
I've read a fair amount about like child-raising practices in non-Western and indigenous cultures. I'm wondering if you knew anything about that. And usually, like in terms of like what comes to mind with this is like punishment. Like in many traditional societies, like punishing or beating a child, like hitting a child for punishment is like unheard of, or like they would never consider that. I don't know if there's anything like how it's held in Thailand.
I don't think it's so as idealized as that, because there definitely it does actually, but it's also again, it's sort of more like the action is exceptional rather than taken exception to, rather than the person, and also I think just the value system through the whole culture is one of a sense of there is a high value placed on a certain moral uprightness without it being tinged with kind of a strong, like as soon as you say moral, even in English, it has this a real preachy sort of quality to it, and so that there's, it's seen as something, noble to be kind or to be generous, and if you're not, I mean, it's not it's better to be kind and generous than it is to be not, but it isn't sort of like you're not an irredeemable person because you're for some reason you're. It's like I remember one time. I've told this story, but it sticks in my mind of this Australian guy who he'd been in Anagarika at Ajahn Chah, and he was, and then he went down to do his visa, and he'd left the training, but then he kept his head shaved, and he kept wearing white because he found it useful, keep him on track, because he could go off track easily, and he was he met up with an owner of a kind of bar nightclub, and he had like an art gallery in Australia, and so he was an artist and designer, and so I got to know the owner, and so he was helping do a redesign of the bar, and but anyway, so he's but they would really look to him as somebody who was, he's lived in a monastery, he's keeping precepts, and he said there was one time, it really struck him, one time where they went into the room where the bouncers and bodyguards hung out, and they're sitting around cleaning their guns and watching pornography, and they immediately shut things down. Okay, so it's just like, because it's just sort of out of respect for him, and not as a this is, and and for many people it's sort of like that sense of if I at some point in time I'm going to have to get it together, and as opposed to some kind of some moral failing that one's tainted by forever.
I've heard that some of it, the Thais have it more, it's like Asian, more family-oriented.
Yes.
So that instead of being a personal thing, so that's why sometimes they have difficulty when they go to like Bangkok, where that pressure then is not there, then they can have anonymity, and then that restraints.
No, that there's a very strong family ties, and that's quite it is a mediating influence, and I don't think in a claustrophobic way or in a weird way, but I think it's a wholesome factor of support.
Like the sense of being a representative of your family. So that your actions reflect upon them.
I realize you may not remember saying it, but when once upon a time you had reflected on the difference of hiri-otappa versus shame, that hiri-otappa was, and this really stuck with me, is thinking, I kind of missed the mark on that particular action. I'd rather do better in the future. Versus saying, oh my gosh, I'm such a horrible person, I can't believe I did that, why did I do that, I'm such a bad person.
There's an obsession with me that sort of tags along, which is quite different. It's sort of okay.
Maybe one's a little more compassionate then, more understanding.
Actually, I mean, like traditionally, the foundation of both hiri and otappa are respect. Like one refrains from unskillful action because respect for oneself. So one doesn't want to do things that are harmful or are going to seed the mind or the heart with things that one has to remember, and otappa is its root is in respect for others, because our actions have effects towards others. So it's understanding the nature of karma, and two is fundamental respect for oneself and respect for others.
So would that be hiri-otappa is much deeper than sampajanya?
Huh?
Sampajanya.
Totally different. Don't mix things up.
Even though like the Thais there's not a lot of like self wrapped up in the like quote unquote unskillful actions. It still means that like they still experience like addictive behaviors.
Oh yeah, no problem. And no problem there. I mean, it's not. Yeah, I mean, that's one of the big problems in the northeast of Thailand, the amount of alcohol and now, huh? Yeah, amphetamines. It's a big, it's not a small thing, not a small problem.
Well, I was just wondering, did the sutta say anything about gambling, like specifically? Was that? I don't think I ever seen that mentioned.
What gambling is what's the proper term? It's the doorway to decline. I can't remember what the proper term is.
I just happened to see one of the Sutra Central yesterday that went off on a whole series of, like, you can't expect you to have a wife and people will trust your word. I can't remember this. Where was the Sutra?
I stumbled across it recently as well.
Mm-hmm. It was fairly unique to me. It happened to be like the random one on the homepage of Sutra Central, and it was.
Yeah, and I was trying because it's that sense of it's like the doorway to decline and.
Yeah, one of them was for like greater benefit. This it was a series of like whatever the number was, 6 things. Intoxicants, gambling. There was a series of things and all reasons why you shouldn't do them. It was like not your word isn't trusted. Your material gain is guaranteed to be squandered. One isn't likely to get a suitable wife, and not trustworthy word.
Even if one does, then one loses.
Yeah,
it's easy to lose everything in the family. So yeah, it's something that is. The Buddha definitely doesn't. He's not silent on the issue. My mind's completely spacing. There's a proper word for it. Okay. Oh, good grief.